Emily Dimmock was 22 years old when her life ended in a small rented flat in Camden Town, London, in September of 1907. Her name would become inseparable from one of Edwardian England's most disturbing unsolved murders, a case that exposed the fault lines of class, morality, gender, and justice in a society caught between Victorian restraint and modern uncertainty. The man accused of killing her, Robert Wood, would walk free after one of the most sensational trials of the era, leaving behind a question that is never fully settled, whether justice was done or merely performed. Emily was born on the 20th of October, 1884, in the village of Standon, Hertfordshire. Her childhood was unsettled. Her parents moved frequently, and as she grew older, stability remained elusive. Like many young women of her generation, Emily left home early in search of independence and employment, eventually entering domestic service. But Edwardian London was not kind to single women without connections or protection. Jobs were scarce, wages were low, and the city offered little safety net for those who slipped through its cracks. At some point before 1907, Emily left domestic service and entered a far more dangerous line of work. Under the name Phyllis, she became a sex worker, operating in and around Camden Town. She lodged for a time in a brothel run by a man named John Crabtree, where she was known to regular clients and earned enough to support herself. This double life would later become central to the investigation into her death, shaping how she was perceived by police, the press, and the public. In early 1907, Emily's circumstances appeared to change for the better. She met a young man named Bertrand Shaw, just 19 years old, employed as a dining car attendant on the Midland Railway Night Express between London and Sheffield. Shaw became deeply attached to Emily. The two moved in together, first in modest lodgings and later into a flat at 29 St. Paul's Road in Camden Town. Though unmarried, they presented themselves as husband and wife. Shaw worked long overnight shifts, leaving each afternoon around 4:30 and returning the following morning. He believed that his income allowed Emily to abandon sex work altogether, and for a time the appearance of domestic stability was carefully maintained. Yet behind this facade, Emily continued her former activities in secret. Once Shaw departed for his nightly duties, she returned to the streets and pubs she knew well. One of these was the Rising Sun Public House on Euston Road, a familiar gathering place for her clients. This pattern of concealment would later complicate the timeline of her final hours and expand the list of potential suspects far beyond her domestic circle. On Wednesday, the 11th of September, 1907, Emily waved Shaw goodbye as usual before he left for work. It was still early afternoon. She remained inside the flat for a time, then later prepared to go out. That evening, she was seen at the Rising Sun. It would be the last confirmed sighting of her alive. The following morning, Thursday the 12th of September, Bertrand Shaw's mother arrived at the flat. She had traveled from Northampton, expecting to be received by the woman her son intended to marry. There was no answer when she knocked. Shaw himself arrived home later that morning. Surprised to find his mother waiting outside, unable to open the door, he obtained a spare key from the landlady and entered the flat. Inside, the scene was immediately alarming. Drawers had been pulled out and emptied onto the floor. Personal items were scattered. The shutters were closed, blocking daylight. On the bed lay Emily's body. She was positioned on her left side, one arm drawn behind her back, the other resting near her head. Her throat had been cut. Police were summoned at once. Their examination revealed that the killer had washed blood from their hands in the basin and dried them on a towel, which was left behind. Several personal items were missing, including a silver watch, a purse, rings, and a curb chain with a small attached charm. Yet the room itself did not suggest a simple robbery. One item in particular drew attention. Emily's postcard album, usually kept closed in a drawer, lay open, as if recently examined. A post-mortem examination placed Emily's time of death between 3:30 and 4 o'clock that morning. Shaw was eliminated as a suspect, having been on duty aboard the night train at the time. With no signs of forced entry and the flat locked from the outside, police concluded that Emily likely admitted her killer voluntarily, or that the person possessed a key. As the investigation unfolded, further peculiarities emerged. A partially burned letter was discovered in the fireplace. Witnesses from Emily's social circle came forward, including a ship's cook named Robert Percival Robertson, who claimed to have spent several nights with her shortly before her death. He described seeing a letter and a postcard written in the same distinctive handwriting, inviting Emily to meet at Camden Town establishments. One of these messages had been signed under a false name and accompanied by a drawing of a rising sun. These details shifted the investigation beyond the flat itself into Emily's past relationships and secret correspondences. The police began to suspect that the killer had been searching not for valuables, but for something personal, perhaps incriminating, perhaps emotional. Someone who knew Emily, knew her habits, and knew where to look. As the newspapers seized upon the story, public fascination grew. Camden Town became synonymous with scandal. The murder of Emily Dimmock was no longer simply a violent crime. It was a mirror held up to Edwardian society, reflecting uncomfortable truths about desire, respectability, and whose lives were considered worth protecting. And somewhere within those unanswered questions, a name would soon rise to prominence: Robert Wood, an artist, an engraver, a man from a respectable family, whose connection to Emily Dimmock would place him at the center of a trial that divided London and left history without a verdict. In the days following Emily Dimmock's murder, police quickly realized that whoever had killed her had not acted blindly. The condition of the flat suggested familiarity rather than chaos. Drawers had been searched deliberately. Specific items were missing, while others of value were left untouched. Most telling of all was the postcard album, removed from its drawer and opened, as if someone had been looking for something particular. Attention soon turned to Emily's private correspondence. Among the fragments recovered from the fireplace were the remains of a partially burned letter. Though badly damaged, investigators were able to reconstruct portions of its contents. It appeared to be an invitation, asking Emily to meet someone in Camden Town on the evening of Wednesday, the 11th of September. The letter had been deliberately destroyed, not casually discarded. This suggested intention, perhaps even fear. Further insight came from Robert Percival Robertson, the ship's cook, who admitted to spending time with Emily in the days before her death. He told police that on the Wednesday afternoon, 2 letters had been delivered to the flat. Emily showed them to him. One of them, he recalled clearly, read, "Will you meet me at the Eagle, Camden Town, 8:30 tonight?" It was signed, though Robertson could not remember the exact name. After reading it, Emily burned the letter in the fireplace. Robertson also described a postcard Emily had shown him earlier. It was written in the same handwriting. Instead of naming a meeting place, it featured a drawing of a rising sun. The message was affectionate and informal, signed with a female name that appeared false. Emily had told him it was from a man she knew. After her death, this postcard could not be found anywhere in the flat. Police now believed that the killer may have taken the postcard with them. This theory gained strength when Bertrand Shaw, searching through the flat days later, discovered the missing postcard concealed beneath the lining of a drawer. He immediately handed it over to authorities. Recognizing its potential importance, the police released an image of the postcard to newspapers nationwide, hoping someone might identify the handwriting. They did not have to wait long. 2 people independently came forward, both claiming to recognize the handwriting as belonging to the same man, Robert Wood. Wood was a skilled artist and engraver, employed at the London glasswork. He was known as quiet, polite, and intelligent, with none of the outward roughness often associated with violent crime. He came from a respectable family. To many who later followed the case, this contrast would become one of its most unsettling features. One of the individuals who recognized the handwriting was Ruby Young, a young woman who, like Emily, worked as a prostitute. Ruby told police that she had been involved with Robert Wood for nearly 2 years. She said she recognized his handwriting instantly and without hesitation. According to her, Wood had often written letters and postcards in the same distinctive style. Before Ruby could speak to the authorities, however, Wood visited her himself. He told her that he had seen the postcard reproduced in the newspapers and feared she might recognize his handwriting. He explained that he had once met a woman calling herself Phyllis at the Rising Sun public house. She had asked him to write a postcard for her, dictating the message and requesting that he sign it under a false name. He insisted it was an innocent favor, nothing more. He then begged Ruby not to involve the police, claiming his father was gravely ill and that a scandal would destroy him. Ruby promised silence. Another man, Jack Tinkman, a colleague of Wood's at the glassworks, also recognized the handwriting. Wood gave him the same explanation and made the same plea. Tinkman, believing Wood to be incapable of such violence, agreed not to report his suspicions. For a time, the case stalled. Police continued interviewing Emily's former associates, clients, and acquaintances. The brothel keeper John Crabtree named several men who had shown unhealthy interest in Unhelly, including one known as Scotch Bob, who had once threatened her with a razor, but each suspect either produced an alibi or vanished without trace. Witnesses reported seeing a man with Emily in the days before her death, but descriptions varied. One man claimed to have seen someone leaving 29 St. Paul's Road early on the morning of the 12th. He could not identify the face, but noted an unusual, jerky walk. Still, no arrest was made. The break came not from police work but from conscience. Ruby Young confided in a friend about Robert Wood's request for silence. Disturbed by what she had heard, the friend contacted a journalist from the Weekly Dispatch. The information was passed to Inspector Arthur Neal of Scotland Yard, who arranged to meet Ruby privately at Piccadilly Police Station on the 4th of October 1907. After hearing her account, police acted swiftly. Robert Wood was arrested and taken into custody. 2 days later, he was formally charged with the murder of Emily Dimmock. The arrest sent shockwaves through London. Newspapers seized on the story immediately. The contrast between victim and accused could not have been sharper. Emily Dimmock, a woman living on society's margins whose past was dissected in public with ruthless enthusiasm. Robert Wood, a softly spoken artist from a respectable home, defended by friends, family, and colleagues who insisted he was incapable of violence. Public opinion fractured almost overnight. Some believed the case was straightforward. Wood had known Emily, corresponded with her secretly, attempted to silence a witness, and could not account for his movements on the night of the murder. Others argued that the evidence was circumstantial, the witnesses unreliable, and the police too eager to close a sensational case. As preparations began for trial, the atmosphere surrounding the case grew fevered. The Old Bailey would soon host one of the most closely watched proceedings of the Edwardian era. Prostitutes, artists, journalists, moral reformers, and social elites all claimed a stake in the outcome. The murder of Emily Dimmock had ceased to be a private tragedy. It had become a national spectacle, and at its center stood Robert Wood, not yet convicted, not yet acquitted, a man whose fate would depend not only on evidence but on how justice itself was understood in an age obsessed with appearances. The trial of Robert Wood opened at the Old Bailey on the 12th of December 1907, and from the moment proceedings began, it was clear that this was no ordinary murder case. The public gallery filled before the doors officially opened, occupied by journalists, social reformers, artists, prostitutes, and curious onlookers drawn by a crime that seemed to sit uncomfortably between two worlds. Outside, crowds gathered in the streets, waiting for word of what would unfold inside the courtroom. At the center of the storm stood Robert Wood. He was 27 years old, neatly dressed, and composed in appearance. Those who had worked alongside him described him as quiet, thoughtful, and reserved. His demeanor did not align with the public's expectations of a murderer, and this contrast would become a defining feature of the trial. The prosecution's case rested on a chain of circumstances rather than direct physical evidence. There was no murder weapon. No witness had seen Wood commit the act. No blood-stained clothing had been recovered. Instead, the Crown sought to establish motive, opportunity, and behavior that, taken together, suggested guilt. Central to this effort was the testimony of Ruby Young. When Ruby took the stand, the courtroom fell into a tense silence. She was well aware that her credibility would be challenged. As a woman engaged in prostitution, her character was already under scrutiny, and the defense would not hesitate to exploit that reality. Nonetheless, Ruby spoke clearly and with confidence. She told the court that she had known Robert Wood for nearly 2 years and that she recognized his handwriting immediately when she saw the postcard reproduced in the newspapers. She described the nature of their relationship, admitting that it was intimate, and stated that Wood had visited her shortly after the postcard was published. According to Ruby, Wood asked her not to inform the police that she recognized his handwriting and requested that she provide him with an alibi if questioned. The defense moved quickly to undermine her testimony. Ruby was questioned at length about her profession, her personal relationships, and her possible motives. Suggestions were made that she sought financial reward or revenge. Ruby denied these accusations firmly. She insisted that she had come forward because she believed it was the right thing to do. Another key witness was Joseph Lambert, a friend of Robert Wood, who testified that he had seen Wood in Emily Dimmock's company shortly before her death. This testimony established that Wood and Emily were known to each other and that their relationship extended beyond a single meeting. The prosecution argued that this familiarity placed Wood among the small group of individuals who could have gained access to Emily's flat without arousing suspicion. Additional witnesses placed Wood in the vicinity of Camden Town on the night of the murder. One man described seeing a figure leaving St. Paul's Road early in the morning, noting a distinctive, jerky walk. While he could not identify the face, the prosecution suggested the description was consistent with Wood's mannerisms. Perhaps most damaging was the cumulative effect of the evidence. The letters, the postcard, the attempt to suppress recognition of the handwriting, and the absence of a clear alibi for the early morning hours all pointed, in the prosecution's view, toward a man attempting to conceal his involvement. Yet the defense was formidable. Robert Wood was represented by Sir Edward Marshall Hall, one of the most celebrated defense barristers of the era. Known for his commanding presence and emotional intelligence, Marshall Hall approached the case with precision. Rather than attempting to prove Wood's innocence outright, he focused on dismantling the prosecution's narrative piece by piece. He emphasized the lack of physical evidence repeatedly. No weapon had been found. None of Emily Dimmock's missing possessions had ever been recovered from Wood or linked to him in any demonstrable way. The crime scene, he argued, offered no conclusive proof of Wood's presence. Marshall Hall also addressed Wood's alleged attempts to suppress Ruby Young's testimony. He framed these actions not as evidence of guilt, but as the panic of a respectable man fearing public disgrace. In Edwardian society, association with prostitutes carried devastating social consequences regardless of innocence. According to the defense, Wood's behavior reflected self-preservation, not murder. The defense further questioned the reliability of witness testimony. Several witnesses admitted under cross-examination that they had consumed alcohol on the nights in question. Others conceded that their recollections had been influenced by newspaper reports. Marshall Hall reminded the jury that memory is fragile, especially under the pressure of a sensational case. Then came a decision that surprised many in the courtroom. Robert Wood chose to testify in his own defense. From the moment he took the stand, reactions were mixed. He spoke calmly and denied killing Emily Dimmock. He acknowledged knowing her and admitted to writing the postcard, insisting that it was done at her request and without romantic or sinister intent. He explained that he had used a false name because Emily had asked him to do so. However, his demeanor unsettled some observers. Rather than displaying visible distress, Wood appeared detached. At times, he sketched the courtroom and its occupants while seated in the witness box. This behavior was noted by journalists and later cited as either evidence of artistic habit or emotional coldness. Marshall Hall worked tirelessly to reframe this impression, reminding the jury that demeanor alone is not evidence of guilt. He urged them to focus on facts rather than impressions, on proof rather than personality. In his closing address, Marshall Hall delivered one of the most memorable speeches of his career. He spoke of reasonable doubt, of the danger of condemning a man based on suspicion and social prejudice. He reminded the jury that Emily Dimmock's lifestyle had exposed her to countless men, any one of whom could have committed the crime. To single out Wood, he argued, was to mistake coincidence for certainty. When the judge summed up the case, he did something unusual. Rather than reinforcing the prosecution's theory, he emphasized the absence of direct evidence and reminded the jury of their duty to acquit if doubt remained. The jury retired. They returned just 15 minutes later. Their verdict would reverberate far beyond the walls of the Old Bailey. When the jury returned to the courtroom after just 15 minutes of deliberation, the speed of their decision sent a visible ripple through the public gallery. Many had expected hours, perhaps days, given the complexity of the evidence and the gravity of the charge. Instead, the foreman stood, faced the bench, and delivered the verdict, not guilty. The reaction was immediate and explosive. A cheer rose from the gallery, spilling into the corridors and then out into the streets beyond the Old Bailey. Word of the acquittal spread rapidly through London. Crowds gathered outside the court, waved hats and umbrellas. Fireworks were reportedly set off in celebration, and performances in West End theaters were interrupted so the verdict could be announced to audiences. Robert Wood left the courthouse flanked by his father and brother, surrounded by a public convinced that an innocent man had narrowly escaped a terrible miscarriage of justice. Yet not everyone shared in the jubilation. For Emily Dimmock, there would be no further proceedings, no appeal, and no closure. Her murder remained officially unsolved. With Wood acquitted, the case effectively ended, and the Metropolitan Police quietly withdrew active investigation. No alternative suspect was ever charged. No new evidence emerged. The flat at St. Paul's Road returned to anonymity, its violent history fading from public memory, even as debate continued elsewhere. In the days following the trial, public opinion hardened along familiar social lines. Many newspapers praised Sir Edward Marshall Hall's defense as a triumph of justice and reason. Others, more cautiously, noted the fragility of the evidence and the ease with which doubt had prevailed. Editorials emphasized the dangers of convicting a man based on circumstantial evidence alone, particularly when witnesses came from what were described as morally questionable backgrounds. Ruby Young bore the brunt of the backlash. She was widely portrayed as vindictive, opportunistic, or deceitful. Rumors circulated that she had attempted to frame Wood in pursuit of reward money, despite no evidence supporting such claims. Facing public hostility and social isolation, Ruby changed her name and disappeared from public record. Later reports suggested she married and lived under a new identity, though her subsequent life remains largely undocumented. Robert Wood resumed his career quietly. He continued working as an illustrator, though often under pseudonyms, and avoided public attention. He married some years later, but the marriage ended in divorce. He remained in London for much of his life and died in 1969 at the age of 92. He never publicly revisited the case, never wrote a memoir, and never offered further explanation beyond what he had already given at trial. Bertrand Shaw, Emily's partner, faded from the public narrative as well. His grief was largely overlooked amid the spectacle of the trial and the controversy surrounding the acquittal. There is no record that he was ever formally suspected or reinvestigated, despite later speculation that questioned whether his alibi truly accounted for every hour of the night Emily was killed. As the years passed, theories multiplied. Some believed Emily had been murdered by a client whose identity was never uncovered, perhaps someone angered by disease, money, or rejection. Others suggested the crime bore the marks of a crime of passion rather than premeditation, pointing to the personal nature of the wounds and the apparent search through her belongings. There were also those who remained convinced that Robert Wood had killed Emily and escaped justice through social advantage, skilled advocacy, and a legal system more inclined to doubt the testimony of women like Ruby Young than the word of a softly spoken artist from a respectable family. Equally persuasive were the arguments against his guilt. There was no physical evidence tying Wood to the crime scene. The letters and postcard established contact, not violence. The alleged attempt to suppress testimony could be interpreted as fear of scandal rather than fear of conviction, and the jury, having heard everything, found the case insufficient to condemn him. The truth is that the murder of Emily Dimmock sits at the intersection of class, gender, morality, and justice in Edwardian England. Her profession ensured she was scrutinized differently, remembered differently, and ultimately protected less than others might have been. Her death became a spectacle, her life reduced to a footnote in a courtroom drama that focused far more on the fate of the accused than on the woman who lost her life. More than a century later, the case remains unresolved. No confession was ever made, no new suspect emerged, no definitive answer replaced speculation. What remains is a locked-room mystery shaped by missing evidence, social prejudice, and a verdict that closed the courtroom but not the question. Who killed Emily Dimmock? The law gave its answer. History, however, still has not.